Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along to this presentation, and thank you for the invitation to present at CONBRACAS. My name is Emma Garnett, and I'll be talking today about why it's important for the environment and our health to reduce the amount of meat that we consume. And now I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can now all see that. I live and work in the United Kingdom. I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I'll be talking about work I did during my PhD at the Department of Zoology, funded by NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council. So the stakes are high. What approaches work to increase vegetarian sales and reduce meat consumption? Producing food has transformed our planet, arguably more than any other human activity. Our food system is responsible for about 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. It takes up 38% of Earth's ice-free land and is responsible for about 70% of freshwater withdrawals. So why is reducing meat and dairy consumption important? Unfortunately, livestock farming is a leading cause of habitat loss, climate change, and biodiversity loss. And this is for two main reasons. Firstly, it's inefficient to feed, for example, soy to livestock and then to people instead of eating it directly ourselves. Secondly, cows and sheep are ruminants, so they release methane as part of their digestion. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And cows and sheep also take up a large amount of land that could otherwise be, for example, forest or wetland. And so farmed animal products, meat and dairy, are responsible for 18% of our calories and 37% of our protein. However, they take up 83% of farmed land use and 58% of greenhouse gas emissions. So they have a disproportionate environmental impact for what we're getting from them nutritionally. So let's take a look at the carbon footprint of some protein-rich foods. And this is looking at kilos of greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein. And you can see that worst for the climate up at the top, cows, sheep, and prawns. Intermediate there are pigs, poultry, and fish. And at the bottom, best for the climate, tofu, beans, and nuts. It's important to note there is a wide variation in these greenhouse gas footprint estimates. So you can see beef from beef herd going from all the way from 20 kilos all the way up to over 100. However, you can also see that even the best performing, lowest carbon footprint meat, fish, and dairy products tend to have a higher carbon footprint than the worst tofu, nuts, ground nuts, and other peas and pulses. Now let's take a look at the land footprint of protein-rich foods. This just shows the average and not the variation. And it's a similar but a slightly different picture. Again, cows and sheep taking up the most land, intermediate levels of land use, pigs, poultry, nuts, and at the bottom, farmed fish, tofu, and peas. Good news is healthy foods and sustainable diets overlap quite a lot. So there was a study conducted that found that foods in this bottom left quarter are good for health and have a low environmental impact. So that's nuts, legumes, fruits, vegetables, those kinds of things. And in the top right corner, you can see unprocessed red meat and processed red meat has a high environmental impact and is not so good for health either. Processed and red meat have links with bowel cancer and heart disease. There are some important exceptions. So you can see fish here has quite a high environmental impact, but is quite good for health. And at the bottom here, sugar sweetened beverages, quite a low environmental impact, but not great for our health. Farming animals at current levels also has a whole suite of other issues. So the widespread antibiotic use with livestock is contributing to antimicrobial resistance. There is, of course, concerns about animal welfare. More than 70 billion animals are raised and killed a year. There have also been documented impacts on abattoir workers and the psychological impacts of working in those environments. And also food poisoning often comes from meat, fish, and dairy, as well as salad and other plant-based products. And in the UK, there's quite a lot of concern about a possible trade deals that might result in chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef coming into the UK. So I think meat and farming touches on so many different aspects of our life and concerns. So what does a global sustainable diet look like? The Eat Lancet report devised a diet that could feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries. And in a nutshell, it's a lot of nuts and beans and other vegetables and whole grains, and very little meat, fish, and dairy. So per week, they recommend about 85 grams of red meat, that's beef, lamb, pork, and that's about 1.5 sausages. They also recommend about 200 grams of chicken, that's 2 small portions, 200 grams of fish, and the equivalent of 7 glasses of milk. And so over a year, this adds up to about 15.5 kilos of meat per person per year. And let's round that up to 17 kilos to account for food waste. But how much meat are we actually eating? And the answer is much, much more than that. So in the UK and also in Brazil, we're eating more than 4 times the recommended sustainable amount. In the UK, that's 81 kilos, and Brazil and China, very steep increases in meat consumption over the last few decades from 1961 to 2013. The USA, out of these countries, has highest meat consumption at 115 kilos per person per year. And whereas Nigeria and India are on average 9 and 4 kilos, so below that 17 kilogram sustainable diet recommended amount. And globally, from 1961 to 2013, meat consumption per person has almost doubled from 23 kilos to 43 kilos. And our population has more than doubled from 3 billion to 7 billion. So meat production has quadrupled worldwide, and unfortunately, this simply isn't sustainable. Comparing Brazil and UK meat consumption in a little bit more detail, you can see poultry, that's there at the bottom in blue, has increased very steeply in both countries. In the UK, actually, our beef consumption there in green is decreasing slightly, whereas beef consumption is continuing to rise in Brazil. There was an interesting Greenpeace video on deforestation and livestock farming, voiced by the Brazilian actor Wagner Moura. And I will show this video in the Portuguese version. If you'd like to have a look for the English or Spanish, you can search on YouTube for "There's a Monster in My Kitchen, Greenpeace UK," or in Spanish, "Hay un monstruo en mi cocina, la historia detrás de la deforestación," from Greenpeace España.
Tem um monstro na cozinha. Eu não chego perto, não. Ele tem olhos de fogo e rabo de assombração. E garras tão grandes e afiadas que cortam como facão. Destruiu a lista de compras e derrubou a carne no fogão. Ele rosnou para os ossos do nosso churrasco de verão. Será que ele está com fome? Espero que eu não seja a refeição. Tem um monstro na cozinha que me enche de pavor. O que faz aqui, seu monstro? Me explica, por favor. Tem um monstro na floresta. Eu não chego perto, não. Fez meu mundo virar cinzas para criar uma plantação. Ração para vacas, porcos e galinhas que viram carne para você. Enquanto eles enchem os bolsos, nós ficamos à mercê. Eles se sentem poderosos, mas um dia apagarão. O verdadeiro preço desses atos, em breve todos saberão. Tem um monstro na floresta que me enche de pavor. Venho aqui contar para o mundo o tamanho desse horror. Moça na cozinha, eu já tenho a solução. Vamos comer frutas e verduras e trocar carne por feijão, farofa, batata doce, mandioca e agrião. Vou chamar todos os guerreiros da nossa grande nação. Nossa, na cozinha. Eu já tenho a solução. Vai salvar sua floresta e acabar com esse vilão.
So a very powerful video. And I find it very interesting, a lot of the discussion in the UK, comparing British and Brazilian meat. So there's quite an inaccurate view from some in the UK that British meat has a low environmental footprint and it's only South American meat which is a problem. So some quotes from the British National Farmers Union: "We do not clear rainforests to make way for beef and lamb production. British meat does not come from the ashes of the Amazon." And there's a clear distinction between the grass-fed regenerative beef farming in the UK and cattle ranching in the Amazon. However, this is inaccurate. Grass-fed beef or lamb, no matter where it is in the world, it is not good for the climate. European livestock are fed on Brazilian soy, some of which has links to deforestation. And grassland ecosystems are very different most of the time from farmed pasture. So you can see in this top picture, this very short, bright green grass, compared to the bottom picture, where you have a much more varied vegetation with flowers and trees, as well as grasses. There was a BBC documentary that came out last year called Meat, A Threat to Our Planet. And the presenter was flying over the Amazon in Brazil. And she said, it's like flying over the British countryside and we're in the middle of the Amazon. And I think this really shows that, in the UK, we have deforested an awful lot of our country historically. And in fact, we do have threatened rainforest. So the UK, like Brazil, has rainforest threatened by overgrazing and conversion. So a quote from the UK Woodland Conservation Trust: "Our rainforest is threatened. It has suffered long-term declines through clearances, chronic overgrazing, and conversion to other uses. This has left it small and fragmented." And you can see in the picture on the left an example of UK rainforest. So this is temperate, not tropical rainforest, sometimes called Celtic or Atlantic rainforest. And in the UK, we have some of the lowest forest cover in Europe at 13%. And we're also a net importer of meat, so we eat more than we're producing. In Brazil, there are very high rates of deforestation, but there's still 60% forest cover, and Brazil is a net exporter of meat, so eating less than is being produced. So to give an environmental summary, reducing meat consumption is really vital to combat climate change and improve human health. Livestock have a high climate and land footprint, and the more land that's used for food means the less space there is for nature. And even the lowest meat and dairy foods have higher climate footprints than the worst plant-derived foods. And there's also a tendency for every country to defend their livestock farming, which is understandable. So some in the UK, do have valid concerns about Amazon deforestation. However, whilst choosing to ignore in the UK our very high levels of meat consumption and our historic deforestation and low forest cover. So how could we change diets? There's a fantastic quote I really like from Lisa Simpson, as she says, "The whole world wants me to eat meat. I can't fight it anymore." And so some of the approaches we might think of for changing people's eating habits that aren't educational information, which can often be quite ineffective. So we could think about economic incentives, changing the price of meat and vegetarian options, or also nudging or choice architecture. And this is strategic changes in the physical and social environment, which we anticipate will alter people's behavior in a predictable way. However, this is without forbidding any options. So not taking meat off the menu completely, but what might work to encourage people to eat more vegetarian and vegan food. And so imagine you're in a cafeteria. What do you think might influence the meal that you would choose? Are you influenced by health, the taste of it, the sustainability, ethics, animal welfare, religion, its price? the availability, the cafeteria layout. What do you think would influence what you would choose in a canteen like this one? And for my PhD, this was my research study setting. University of Cambridge college cafeterias within Cambridge in the UK. And I looked at 3 different interventions: order, availability, and price. And I'll explain those in more detail. And the outcome we were interested in was the percentage of vegetarian main meals sold. And we had a fantastic data set on sales data with more than 200,000 individual meal selections. So the first intervention we considered was vegetarian position and order. And we hypothesized that we'd see higher vegetarian sales when the vegetarian option is placed first in line, i.e. nearest the cafeteria entrance. And this is because place healthy things first, it's widely assumed to be effective, but largely untested. And in fact, this is the first page in the book, Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, which has been hugely influential. They describe that in some schools, the desserts were placed first, in others last. In some schools, the French fries, but in others, the carrot sticks were at eye level. And simply by rearranging the cafeteria, Carolyn was able to increase or decrease the consumption of many food items by as much as 25%. So this is a very strongly held belief in various spheres. You just put things nearest the entrance and people will pick them. And this was our research setup. So we carried out experimental studies alternating between meat first and veg first, week by week, across 9-week university terms in college cafeterias. And so this setup on the left, you can see that meat is nearest the entrance and vegetarian is placed last. And then in the middle, we have this veg first condition with the vegetarian nearest the entrance and the meat further behind, and swapping between these two setups. However, there's another important consideration, as well as which is nearest the entrance, but the different distances between the meat and vegetarian options. So in these figures on the left and in the middle, there was an 85 centimeter distance between the meat and vegetarian options in one of the cafeterias, and we'll call this short distance. However, in another cafeteria, there was 180 centimeters difference between the meat and vegetarian options, and there were side dishes, plates, and other different things between the meat and vegetarian option. So what were the results from changing vegetarian order? So these graphs show you results from meat first condition in yellow and veg first in blue. Up on the y-axis here, that's vegetarian sales as a percentage of total sales. And what we found was, under a short distance condition, the results were quite complicated, but essentially putting the vegetarian option first did not increase sales. And in fact, in some conditions, sales were actually lower, which was quite counterintuitive. However, under the long distance condition, putting the vegetarian option first was effective. We saw about a 5 percentage point increase in vegetarian sales, which was quite powerful. So can putting vegetarian options first, nearest the entrance in cafeterias, increase their sales? So yes, when the meat option was over 1.5 meters away. However, when the meal options are adjacent, are next to each other, putting the vegetarian option first didn't increase sales and could backfire. And so it's really important to test our intuitions, things that we think will work to change food behaviors with data, testing out our assumptions. This paper came out last year, and there was a bit of write-up in the press, and it was great to see they really emphasized people are more likely to choose a vegetarian option if the meat option is further away. And for the next 2 interventions I'll talk about, we were able to track anonymized individuals. So students pay for meals with their university cards. So we can track anonymized individuals. And using data from previous terms before the experiments, we divided diners into quartiles based on how often they chose vegetarian meals. And statistically, this makes our results much, much more powerful. And you can see along the bottom, so dividing diners into quartiles from most vegetarian in dark blue, more veg, less veg, and then least veg in red, the people least likely to pick a vegetarian option, the most carnivorous diners. So our second intervention, we looked at the availability of vegetarian options. And we hypothesized that as we increase the proportion of vegetarian options, that would increase vegetarian sales. And we carried out this study in 2 college cafeterias, and we naturally varied the number of vegetarian and total options served. So, for example, at Monday lunchtime, there are 3 options that students could pick from, 2 of which are vegetarian. So that's 67% vegetarian availability. Moving on to Wednesday lunchtime, there are 4 options that students could choose, 2 of which were vegetarian or vegan. So that's a 50% vegetarian availability. And here are the results. And we found that doubling vegetarian availability, that's this across the x-axis, from 25% to 50%, led to approximately a 15 percentage point increase in vegetarian sales. This is along the y-axis here. And what was really encouraging was that overall sales remained approximately constant. And when we looked at individual diners, what was really encouraging that increasing the vegetarian availability led to all demographics, all 4 groups, buying more vegetarian meals. And in fact, the least vegetarian quartile here in red actually had the strongest response to increasing vegetarian availability. And even the most vegetarian quarter of students also became more likely to pick a vegetarian option when there was simply more available. And the third intervention, sorry, I should say 3, not 2, was price. So price is an important influence on citizen food purchases. And there have been many calls from different reports and organisations for a meat tax, but there are none currently in operation. And certainly within the UK, subsidies really dominate UK farming profits. So you can see particularly grass-fed grazing livestock, over 90% of profits come from subsidies. And even across all farm types, subsidies are responsible for about 60% of profits. And poultry is in fact the lowest. And so we carried out a price experiment in one college cafeteria in autumn term in 2018. And halfway through the term, we increased the meat option price by 20p from £2.52 to £2.72. And we decreased the vegetarian option price by 20p from £2.05 to £1.85. And in this case, the fish and vegan meal prices remained unchanged. And here are the results. So across 106 mealtimes, with 5,330 meals and 325 diners, we found changing the price did lead to a small increase in overall vegetarian sales. However, there was no significant change to overall meat sales. And this uptick in vegetarian sales was really driven by the most vegetarian quartile of diners. You can see them here in dark blue. And they became more likely to pick a vegetarian option by about 12 percentage points, which is really quite a significant uptick. And then this research has also been used to inform policy. So the Cambridge University Sustainable Food Policy was introduced in 2016 by Nick and Paula White. So these are 14 cafeterias, and these are separate from the university colleges, which I've discussed just now. And there were 4 main pillars of the sustainable food policy. Firstly, improving vegetarian and vegan choices and actively promoting them. Secondly, beef and lamb was taken off the menu, it was removed. Thirdly, they were only serving sustainably sourced fish that met Marine Conservation Society standards and was certified as well. And fourthly, they really aimed to cut down on food waste and reduce food waste. And this sustainable food policy had a huge impact. So comparing March to May 2015 with March to May 2018, all of the food procured by the cafeteria, the carbon and land footprint per kilo of food purchased decreased by about a third. And in fact, there was a 2% increase in gross profits. So you can see in this graph on the left, the difference between not having the policy in green and with the policy in blue for the carbon footprint. And we were delighted that this briefly made the BBC News at the front page. University of Cambridge removing meat cut carbon emissions. And if you're interested in hearing more from Nick White about how that got implemented and some of the challenges and the sort of behind the scenes of the success story, if you have a Google for Earth Optimism, Reducing an Organization's Footprint, you can see an interview with Nick White. And so research summary, what works to increase vegetarian options in cafeterias? So placing the vegetarian option first, in some contexts, did increase vegetarian sales by about 5 percentage points, but it was unreliable. Whereas doubling the availability of vegetarian options increased vegetarian sales by about 15 percentage points. And that was effective across all groups of diners. One very small change in price increased vegetarian sales for diners most likely to choose a vegetarian option anyway. A lot of the research that's been done on reducing meat consumption has been happening in North America and Western Europe. And I think we really need research in other countries and across Latin America as well on what approaches are effective in different contexts for lowering meat consumption. Thank you very much for attending this presentation if you've made it this far. And do feel free to get in contact if you have any follow-up questions. My Twitter and email are at the bottom of the screen there. And enjoy the rest of the conference.